Many southern plantation owners wanted to be left to their own devices and resented the power of the federal government over their states, a resentment they expressed in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798 and 99. Favouring the country over the city and agriculture over industry, they looked on the rising commercial power of the North with jaundiced eyes and helped create a tradition of states' rights. First under the leadership of John Randolph of Roanoke, then of John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. They interpreted the Constitution strictly, denying the doctrine of implied powers. Calhoun led South Carolina to the brink of secession in the nullification crisis of 1832 in protest against what he saw as the overmighty claims of President Jackson. Slavery was the motor of the Southern cotton economy. In the early years of the Republic, it seemed possible that slavery would be abolished gradually and peacefully. After 1830, however, Southern intellectuals and politicians began to make positive arguments in favour of slavery and to insist that it was more humane than the free labour system of British and northern factory towns. They were explicit and unashamed racists. Slavery, they said, was a natural and time-honoured system to be found in all the world's civilizations. It had brought the blessings of civilization and Christianity to African savages, protected a group whose natural inferiority made it impossible for them to be able to live independently, and it protected them from cradle to grave. They compared plantations to happy extended families, asserted that God himself gave no evidence in the Bible of objecting to slavery, and they depicted themselves as the moral superiors of the hard-driving Yankee industrialists. Well, Southern conservatives in the early national period resented the federalist attempt to strengthen central government power and to diversify the economy. The economy thrived on the export of raw materials, particularly from the South. During the colonial period, that had chiefly been exports of tobacco and rice and indigo. Then, in 1793, when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, it became possible to grow and to export in huge quantities short staple cotton, and that was the vital commodity of the early British Industrial Revolution and the great spread of the cotton plantation economy throughout the South in the years between the 1790s and the 1850s. There was a massive and almost continuous boom over those decades, as British industry and then Northern American industry demonstrated an immense capacity to transform this cotton into finished fabrics. John Randolph of Roanoke in Virginia and John Taylor of Caroline represented the old-fashioned independent plantation owners who sought patriarchal independence and resented any form of intervention or interference with their own traditional way of life. Randolph was a captivating orator, one of the great congressmen of the early 19th century. He regarded himself as an aristocrat, and he disdained and deplored the development of democracy. One of his most famous remarks is, "I am an aristocrat. I love liberty. I hate equality." And in another famous speech he declared, "That all men are born free and equal, I can never assent to, for the best of all reasons, because it is not true. If there is an animal on earth to which equality at birth does not apply, that is not born free, it is man. He is born in a state of the most abject want and a state of perfect helplessness and ignorance." Now, Randolph had suffered from a severe and disabling illness in his teens. He was impotent. He had a strange, high voice, and he looked very, very odd. But he was a magnetic orator. Listen to this description of him by another congressman. "His head is small, and until you approach him near enough to observe the premature and unhealthy wrinkles that have furrowed his face, you would say that it was boyish. But as your eye turns towards his extremities, everything seems to be unnaturally stretched and protracted. To his short and meagre body are attached long legs, which, instead of diminishing, grow larger as they approach the floor, until they end in a pair of feet broad and large, giving his whole person the appearance of a sort of pyramid. His long straight hair is parted on the top, and a portion hangs down on each side, while the rest is carelessly tied up behind and flows down his back. His voice is shrill and effeminate, and occasionally broken by low tones of the kind you hear from dwarves and deformed people. John Randolph rode around the Virginia countryside in an old English stagecoach with 6 horses. He was very, very touchy on points of honour. Southerners had a great and elaborate code of honour and fought duels when they felt that their authority or dignity had been impeached. Famously, Randolph fought a duel with Henry Clay when he was in his 50s in the 1820s over a perceived insult. Luckily, both men survived the duel, and the only casualty was Randolph's coat, which got a bullet hole, but both men survived unscratched. Now, Randolph's view was that the best kind of government is one that does nothing. He was very afraid of the over-politicisation of the population, something which really had been happening in the feverish 1790s. In Randolph's view, the best legislature is one in which the legislators are fast asleep. You could hardly go further in opposing the idea of activist government than that. Randolph and John Taylor shared Jefferson's view that farmers are intrinsically more virtuous than city dwellers. This is an idea which has a very long history in American politics. It didn't really begin to dissipate until the early 20th century and was still being voiced by people like William Jennings Bryan in the early 1900s. That America is uniquely a farmers' republic and that farmers are intrinsically more virtuous than all other citizens. John Taylor wrote a very, very long and rather tedious book called Arator, which is a long eulogy of rural life. In farming, says Taylor, the practice of almost every moral virtue is amply remunerated in this world, whilst it is also the best surety for attaining the blessings of the next. In other words, you're more likely to go to heaven if you're a farmer. John Taylor wrote pamphlets in answer to Hamilton's report on manufactures. At the very time that Alexander Hamilton was trying to jumpstart an American industrial revolution, Taylor wanted to prevent it because he said if Americans start gathering in cities, they're much more likely to become vulnerable to luxury and vice and to lose the independent virtue upon which is the foundation of this republic. Cities are dens of vice, and the countryside is the home of virtue and manly independence. So Taylor and Randolph were actively opposed to federal projects for building roads and building canals, the infrastructure projects, because they said that those are going to intrude on the state's independence and are going to contribute towards industrialization. Now, in 1803, President Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France. This comprised not just what we now call Louisiana, but all the headwaters of the Mississippi River as far west as the Rocky Mountains. At a stroke, it doubled the territorial extent of the United States and is now regarded by most historians as a marvellous opportunity which Jefferson had the foresight to seize. Now, at the time of the purchase, Randolph supported Jefferson in doing it, but later on realised that he'd compromised his own principles in doing so. Because he was a believer in strict interpretation of the Constitution, it wasn't at all clear that Jefferson actually had the authority under the Constitution to make the purchase. But Jefferson had taken the view that it was an opportunity too good to miss, and he'd seized that opportunity. Gradually, Randolph began to realise he ought not to have done it. Randolph said, "A nation stretching across a continent cannot possibly embody a common interest and a common loyalty. It's too big to retain our sense of loyalty and connection." This was the exact opposite of the mood of manifest destiny, which became so widespread in the 1840s. Taylor wrote an impassioned pamphlet against the Missouri Compromise of 1820. I need to explain that briefly. This was the period when there was a dispute over whether new states could come into the constitutional system, and if they came in as free labour states, they would make the free labour interest in Congress stronger because each would bring 2 new senators. And if they came in as slave states, they'd give a greater emphasis to the slavery interest. So according to the Missouri Compromise, states would be admitted in 2s, 1 free labour and 1 slave, to maintain the balance. Taylor protested against that because he said this is giving the federal government the authority to decide on the labour laws inside the particular states. But in fact, the states are sovereign entities and ought to be able to make up their own minds about things like that. The nullification crisis in which South Carolina acted on John C. Calhoun's arguments, was a trial run for Southern secession. And this is one of those vital moments in the development of the American system, and a test of where ultimate power lay. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1797 and 98 had asserted the sovereignty of the states over that of the federal government, and had argued that the states were entitled to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. This is something I mentioned in the previous lecture. These are the protests against the Alien and Sedition laws. But still the question is, who decides whether or not a law is unconstitutional? Who decides whether it exceeds constitutional limits? John Marshall at the Supreme Court was busy establishing the principle that the Supreme Court should decide, and that the implied powers in the Constitution gave the Supreme Court a broad reach. Marshall's view was that where there's an ambiguity, it's appropriate for the federal government to expand its powers. Now, high tariffs imposed by Congress in 1828 and favouring northern manufacturers over southern planters provoked a protest from Calhoun. Southerners had an interest in tariffs being low because they exported a raw material to England, chiefly cotton, and they imported British manufactures, so they wanted these manufactured goods to be cheap. But northern manufacturers wanted British imports to be expensive so that their own goods could find a market in the face of this competition. Calhoun wrote anonymously the South Carolina Exposition and Protest in 1828 in response to what he called the Tariff of Abominations, this tariff which he said was much too high. He had to write it anonymously because he was the vice president to President Andrew Jackson. In the Fort Hill Address of 1831, Calhoun followed up, asserting the right of the state to interpose itself between the federal government and its own citizens. Central to Calhoun's reasoning was this: the states were sovereign entities before the federal constitution was written. And although these sovereign entities came together to create the Union, nevertheless their prior sovereignty does not lapse. And therefore a state is entitled to judge on whether or not a federal law intrudes upon the sovereignty of the state, and is entitled to nullify it if, in the state's opinion, the federal government's overreached itself. President Jackson certainly didn't accept that principle and threatened military reprisals against South Carolina if it refused to accept the law. A state law passed by South Carolina in 1832 ordered its citizens not to pay the tariff and raised an army of 25,000 volunteers to fight, if necessary, to sustain the principle. It's very clear to us that this is a trial run for the events of 1860 and 1861. President Jackson retaliated by pushing the Force Bill through Congress, authorizing military reprisals against a nullifying state. Well, in the end, the crisis was resolved by Henry Clay of Kentucky, who managed to broker a compromise, preventing the outbreak of hostilities. Both sides could claim victory in the nullification crisis. South Carolina could claim victory because the tariffs were reduced, according to the compromise. The Union could claim victory because the Force Bill was then passed into law, saying that the federal government is entitled to intervene militarily against a rebellious state. Well, the crisis de-escalated, but an even bigger one was on the horizon, and this was the crisis of slavery. Meanwhile, Calhoun followed up on the nullification crisis by writing two studies of the constitutional situation. One was called The Disquisition on Government, and the second was The Discourse on the Constitution and the Government of the United States. And he tried to elaborate more systematically his views about these crises. Like Randolph, he denied the idea of human equality, denied contract theories of government, insisted that liberty comes from life in a well-governed society and not from nature, and reasserted the compact theory, regretting that the founders hadn't specified the prior sovereignty of the individual states. This was really to be one of the most crucial points of division. Does the state's sovereignty trump that of the federal government, or doesn't it? After 1830, defenders of slavery in the South began to argue that their system was not just a necessary evil, as they'd often said up to that time, but was actually a positive good. Slave uprisings among them and pressure from radical abolitionists in the North combined to stimulate the production of a pro-slavery literature. There had been some slave rebellions in the foregoing years which terrified Southern whites. One was the Denmark Vesey uprising the Denmark-Vesey uprising of 1822 in Charleston. A second was the Nat Turner uprising of 1831 in Virginia. Now, also in the 1830s, immediatist abolitionism became a significant component of the debate over slavery. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were immediatist abolitionists who began to argue, we've got to abolish slavery immediately because it's an affront to God himself. Garrison even described the Constitution as a pact with the devil because it incorporated the principle of maintaining slavery. In 1833, the British Empire abolished slavery in its own territories, particularly in the Sugar Islands of the West Indies, and implicitly made a challenge to the United States to keep pace. If you've seen the film Amazing Grace, it tells the story of William Wilberforce, who was the most influential advocate of the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Now, when we think about slavery today, we're forced to recognise certain things that we probably rather forget. Such as that, in the history of the world, slavery was familiar and normal, almost everywhere. You could certainly take the view that the odd thing isn't that Europe and America had slavery, but that eventually they got rid of it. And I think it's important for us to take seriously the idea that the American slave owners were proud people. They weren't shamefaced about having slaves. They were proud of it, and they didn't think of themselves as doing something wrong. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we ought to endorse slavery, but we do need to take seriously that they endorsed it, that they thought they were doing the right thing. I've mentioned repeatedly already in the last few lectures that there was a great admiration among the founding generation, great admiration for classical models from ancient Rome and Greece. And of course, the Americans were therefore looking back to societies which did have slavery. They were ubiquitous. Pro-slavery writers in the American South argued that the racial difference between whites and blacks made slavery entirely appropriate. Early ethnologists argued that to free the slaves would be an act of unkindness because the racial differences between blacks and whites made it impossible for them to live independently. Calhoun himself, one of the most influential Southern writers, wrote, "We now believe it has been a great blessing to both of the races, the European and the African, which by a mysterious providence have been brought together in the southern section of this union. The one has greatly improved, and the other has not deteriorated, while, in a political point of view, it has been the great stay of the Union and our free institutions, and one of the main sources of the unbounded prosperity of the whole. In other words, God himself appears to have actively promoted slavery here, and we've profited greatly from it." Calhoun added that free blacks were much more vulnerable to vice and blindness and madness, and he affirmed this idea that it would be an act of unkindness to free the slaves. Slave owners often refer to the slaves as members of their families. Listen to Henry Watson, an Alabama slave owner. He says, "We feed them, clothe them, nurse them when they are sick, and in all things provide for them. How can we do this and not love them? They too feel an affection for their master, his wife and children, and they are proud of his and their successes. There seems to be a charm in the name of master. They look upon and to their master with the same feeling that a child looks to his father." Well, possibly that was occasionally true, but still the bottom line of American slavery was a question of forced labour. Slaves were property and they could be bought and sold. If the master was in debt, they sometimes had to be sold, whether the owner liked the idea or not. Thomas Jefferson would have liked to free his slaves, but could never do so because he was heavily in debt, and his creditors had a right to prevent him from giving away his property. In fact, the only one of the founding fathers ultimately to liberate all his slaves was George Washington himself. Now, this man Watson, whom I quoted, Henry Watson, and writers like him, perpetuated the myth of the happy plantation far into the 20th century. And of course, in literature like Gone with the Wind, written in the 1930s, you can still find that idea persisting, the idea that everyone was content in the days of slavery, blacks and whites equally alike. Now, the defenders of slavery, the Southern defenders of slavery, most of them were very, very ardent Christians. And they ransacked their Bibles to show that slavery was common in biblical times, and that God, although he had had many opportunities to denounce slavery, never did so. They gave the example of the Old Testament, where the children of Israel escaped from slavery in Egypt, under Moses' leadership. But when they get to the promised land, they then enslave other people. In other words, the implication of that set of stories is, although the children of Israel certainly objected to being slaves themselves, they weren't making a protest against the whole system of slavery, and in fact they themselves then became slave owners. Earlier in the Old Testament, when God chooses Abraham to be the patriarch of Israel, he blesses him with wealth, including countless slaves. Turning to the New Testament, these defenders of slavery said, Jesus never condemned slavery. He certainly could have done so, but he didn't. St. Paul, in one of the epistles, actually directed Onesimus, an escaped slave, to return to his master. This is in the epistle to Philemon. So yet again, here's an obvious moment where it might have been possible to say slavery itself is wrong, and yet God's chosen ones never say it. It was a powerful argument, particularly to people who were thoroughly versed in biblical literature. And of course, the defenders of slavery also make this argument that we've heard from Calhoun. Was it not a kindness to Africans to save them from savagery in Africa and bring them to a Christian land where they could be converted to evangelical Christianity? Of course, this was a generation which completely lacked a sense of what we'd call cultural relativism, and therefore the idea that Africa is simply a savage place would then pass without comment, though now, of course, it would not. Now, at the same time, of course, because they're confronting the abolitionists in the North, who are passionate opponents of slavery, they're aware of that the biblical texts are becoming more and more important. The abolitionists were also ardent Christians, but very often they had to appeal to the spirit of the Gospels. They usually got the worst of the argument when it came to actually citing chapter and verse, because I think it is true that the Bible doesn't lend itself very easily to the anti-slavery position. Certainly, the Southern theologian James Henry Thornwell regarded the abolitionists as very poor Bible scholars, but also as terrifying threats to the social order. He said that the confrontation between slave owner and abolitionist was a parallel to the confrontation between faith and atheism, or between order and anarchy. The slave owners were terrified and utterly dismayed by the militancy of the abolitionists. On the other hand, it's also true that the Christian message cuts both ways, in that the Christian message clearly held the slave owners to a high moral standard, and it was a standard that they very often failed to meet. One of the very greatest historians of the last 30 or 40 years is Eugene Genovese, whose work on the history of slavery has enabled us to see it in a newer and clearer light than ever before. And he points out that pro-slavery preachers in the South used their Bibles to defend slavery, but also used the Bible as a stick with which to beat Southern slave owners. He says, quote, "They peppered their communicants with calls for higher Christian standards and with slashing attacks on the unchristian personal and social behaviour of all too many slaveholders. The ministers were often disgusted by the sexual promiscuity of some owners, the fact that it was an open secret in many communities that the slave owners were forcing female slaves to have sex with them, that some owners were sadistic in the way they flogged the slaves, and that many of them were willing to treat their slaves simply as property rather than as brothers in Christ, as the ministers would have preferred." Now, at one point in his work, Eugene Genovese invents a brilliant speech in which he imagines how a Southern pro-slavery conservative writer might address a Northern conservative as they talked about the rights and wrongs of the slavery system. And here's the speech from the Southern conservative. "You Northern conservatives share our revulsion against growing infidelity and secularism, against the rapid extension of the heresies of liberal theology, against the social and political abominations of egalitarianism and popular democracy, against the mounting assault on the family and upon the very principle of authority. You share our alarm at the growing popularity of the perverse doctrines of Enlightenment radicalism and the French Revolution, the doctrines of Voltaire, Rousseau, Paine. You share our fears for the fate of Western civilization. Yet, you fail to identify the root of this massive theological, ecclesiastical, social and political offensive against Christianity and the social order, the system of free labour, that breeds egotism and extols personal license at the expense of all God-ordained authority. In other words, it's free labour which leads to all these threats to the social order and threats to virtue. That's the real source of the troubles we confront today. Well, the most famous of the critics of free labour in the Old South was George Fitzhugh, a brilliant autodidact of the 1850s. He argued that slavery was infinitely superior to industrial labour in the free North. And he proposed that slavery should, far from being abolished, it ought to spread, and it ought to become much more commonplace among poor whites as well. In two books, one called Sociology for the South from 1854 and another one named Cannibals All from 1857, Fitzhugh argued like this: Northern factories and British factories are much crueler working environments than southern plantations. Why? Well, because they're full of deafening noise and smoke and dangerous machinery in which workers often get trapped. The factories only take on workers when they're old enough to work, and as soon as they're too old or become injured in the machinery, they're thrown out again without compensation. The industrial workers live in the cities, dens of vice and turbulence and threatening political radicalism. But on the other hand, we southern slave owners give our slaves support from the cradle to the grave. Our slaves are brought up in an atmosphere of Christian nurture. We don't put them to work until they're old enough. When they're too old to work, we regard them as venerable members of the family and we give them a protected retirement. We've got the benevolent labour system, not you. Fitzhugh went on to argue that most whites would benefit from slavery just like most blacks. Because, said Fitzhugh, they don't have the qualities to enable them to live independently. Now, Fitzhugh was always an exceptional character, by no means a typical voice in the slavery debate, but he did take some arguments to their logical extreme. Most pro-slavery writers insisted on a very strict colour divide, taking the view the whites ought not to be slaves and the blacks ought to be slaves. And Fitzhugh's interesting to us simply because he was able to take the argument even further, and because he wrote such a sterling indictment of factory labour. It sounds very much like the indictments being made at the same time by people like Charles Dickens in England or Frederick Engels, Marx's friend. When John Randolph of Roanoke visited Ireland, taking a slave with him, he said that his slave was much happier than the Irish peasants, who were ostensibly free, but in fact lived very, very close to absolute subsistence, and in fact were soon to become vulnerable to the devastating Irish famine of the 1840s. Visitors to Jamaica and Trinidad from the United States said that the Brits' ex-slaves were now wretched and that the islands themselves were falling into poverty. Having once been the most valuable part of the British Empire, the Sugar Islands, now that slavery had been abandoned, were becoming imperial backwaters. Young Southerners, particularly those who were likely to inherit slave plantations, went to college, and it was at their colleges that they learned the pro-slavery ideal, at colleges like William and Mary and the University of South Carolina. The colleges encouraged the young men to think of themselves as cavaliers, to link their destiny to the memory of groups like the Royalists in the English Civil War. And many of them put that faith to the test and died for those beliefs, those pro-slavery beliefs, when the Civil War finally came. So I think it's clear from this array of problems and issues, the Southern conservatism in the antebellum period was very, very different from that of the Federalists in the North. And as I'll show next time, it was different again from that of the Northern Whigs, who were the successors to the Federalists. Southern conservatives generally favoured minimal federal government, low tariffs, states' rights, and above all, the defence of slavery.